We're at the Roger Torrey Peterson Estuary Center in Old Lyme, Connecticut, and we have the new Sony 24-70 f2.8 G Master 2. Why is it better than the old version? Well, it's far lighter, about ½ a pound lighter. It's 698 grams versus the old 886 grams. So
what is that in metric?
I thought grams were metric.
Oh, okay. What is that in pounds then? I don't even know.
About ½ a pound's different. Okay. So about almost 2 pounds versus 1.5 pounds. It's lighter, it's smaller, it has better image quality from what we can see, and it has more aperture blades, 11 versus 9. So why does that matter?
We're going to run it through the battery of tests, including why aperture matters. We're going to talk about bokeh and the starburst effect that you get when shooting at f/22. We're going to tell you whether you should upgrade from the older 24-70 f2.8, which is still available for sale. And if you're cross-shopping Canon and Nikon, we're going to compare it to the Canon and Nikon 24-70 f2.8 to see if that smaller size and image quality might be a factor in your decision.
If you're wondering about the price,
it's $2,300 US, $3,000 Canadian.
It seems like a pretty versatile lens. Who do you think really wants something like this?
I think just about everybody. Like, it's perfect for events, weddings, wide shots in portrait photography, landscapes, even courtside sports like volleyball and basketball. The difference in f-stop between f2.8 and f4 is the same as upgrading from APS-C to full frame. So if you have the 24-105 f4, like, this is worth upgrading, especially if you ever do low light, especially if you do astrophotography, or if you ever want a little bit more background separation than you can get with f4.
I think the important thing to ask is if you're actually going to see a difference in image quality with this newer lenses versus the other ones.
Let's take a look at the image quality results.
Okay.
Let's compare the old Sony lens on the left to the new one on the right. In the center of the image at 240 megapixels, the sharpness difference is obvious. The new lens is significantly sharper. At the edge of the frame, the sharpness difference is even greater. They both have significant chromatic aberration. Look at these magenta and green fringes. However, the new lens is significantly better. Let's check them at 70 millimeters. Here we see the new lens is significantly sharper. You can even see the texture of the printing on this book. Look how much clearer the Mark II lens is. It's still sharper at the corners of the frame. Now let's compare the Canon against the new Sony. This is not a pixel shift file, but a single RAW file. In the center of the image at 24 millimeters, I do see significantly more detail out of the Sony, more than could be explained by the megapixel difference. At the edge of the frame, the letters are a little bit more readable on the Sony. They both have a moderate amount of chromatic aberration. Let's compare the Canon and the new Sony at 70 millimeters. In the center, we can see the Sony is significantly sharper. In the corners, the Sony is a little bit sharper. So sharpness is a win for Sony. Let's compare the sharpness of the Nikon lens against the new Sony. In the center of the frame, the Sony is significantly sharper. Here we can see individual eyelashes, which are blurred together on the Nikon. It's pretty close at the edges of the frame, but I do see a little bit more detail out of the Sony. The Sony has worse chromatic aberration though, so the Sony wins for sharpness, but the Nikon wins for chromatic aberration and fringing. Let's check the same lenses at 70 millimeters. Here again, I see more of the printing texture on the Sony than the Nikon, indicating that it's sharper. Note that I gave the Nikon a little bit of an advantage by shooting it at ISO 64 and a longer shutter speed, so it should have gathered more light. At the edges of the frame, the Nikon again makes up some of the difference, but the Sony still wins by a little bit. Here we can see the Sony is just a little bit crisper. Let's compare the contrast and flaring on the Nikon versus the new Sony. We can see much more clarity in the face on the Sony here, indicating that it has better contrast. However, the flaring is actually better controlled on the Nikon. The Sony's flaring is very intrusive here. Zooming in on the eye, you can see in backlit situations, you're going to be better served by the new Sony lens. At 24 millimeters, again, the Sony seems to have better contrast. The bloom on the Nikon is significantly bigger, but the flaring is more controlled and less intrusive. However, overall, the Sony has more contrast and is better in backlit situations. Let's compare the old Sony on the left to the new Sony for contrast and flaring. Right away, you can see the new Sony has much more contrast. The bloom from the strobe is significantly smaller on the new Sony. They both have pretty intrusive flaring, but the new Sony is superior. If you're a portrait or landscape photographer shooting into the sun, you can see the new Sony is totally worth the upgrade. This is so much better than this. These advantages hold true at the wide end of the lens too. Here the flaring and blooming is really bad on the old Sony. And zooming into the eye, the new Sony shows so much more detail. Let's compare the Canon on the left to the Sony on the right. They both have pretty intrusive flaring, with the Canon going right to the edge here. Zooming into the eye, the Canon shows more detail, so the Canon has better contrast than the Sony at 70mm, but how does it look at 24mm? Here the Canon's flaring is worse, but the bloom is actually smaller, indicating that it has better contrast. Let's zoom in. We can see the Canon showing much better detail. Canon has a lot of lens expertise, and here it really shows. Canon wins for contrast, better than the Nikon and both of the Sonys.
There are a few cool things about the Aperture. First of all, you have this nice little clicky Aperture ring, which if you like that tactile experience like Tony and I are always talking about, you're going to be pretty happy with that. It's also a cool feature where you can change your aperture before your camera's even on, so you can always look at it. And it also has 11 aperture blades, which means when it's completely closed down and as small as it gets, it's rounder, meaning that if you have bokeh at that point, it's going to be rounder, cleaner looking bokeh.
Every lens has round bokeh wide open at its lowest f-stop number because the aperture blades are hidden. But as you shut down the aperture blades, it begins to take the shape of the aperture. Shut down moderately, you see the benefits of the 11 aperture blades on the new lens. The bokeh is a little bit more round. You'll only notice this shooting night scenes in cities at moderate apertures, not wide open. Both lenses have the same quantity of bokeh, but the new lens has slightly rounder bokeh balls with smoother edges, and it's a little bit cleaner. You bokeh snobs will need to upgrade.
It also means if you're shooting at f/22 and trying to get a sunburst in a landscape, you're going to have more little bursty lines on your sunburst because you have more aperture blades. Let's see what that looks like.
Both the old and the new lens have a nice clean starburst, but the old lens has a measly 18 starburst points, 2 for each aperture blade. The new lens has 22, and more is more better.
Here's a feature that people doing hybrid video and stills will like. We do have the aperture ring. I like when it's clicky, but you can actually turn the click off and make the aperture smoother. So if you're filming video and you want to pull something into focus, you can do that more smoothly. Okay, click on. Whoa, yeah, it's like a rumble strip on the highway. Now includes a rumble strip. Okay, now let's go to smooth. Wow, they really thought that through, didn't they? You look so pensive, Tony.
I'm acting.
You look so sad. All right. And another way that they considered these hybrid shooters is that they make this zoom smoother. You can actually switch between smooth and tight, and that gives you more or less resistance. And I actually find with a little more resistance, I can more smoothly zoom in my video.
One of the big upgrades is internal. The focusing motors on the lens are much quicker, and that's going to allow you to get faster, more accurate focusing. For those of you who are doing sports, courtside, or maybe wedding photographers photographing people moving up the aisle, that means you're going to get more shots because the camera needs to pause a little bit between each shot to get everything in focus. And if the lens is faster, then it can shoot at a higher frames per second. So I have a Sony A1, which shoots at 30 frames per second. And I'm going to see the effective sharp frames per second with Chelsea here swinging with both the new lens and the old lens.
The A1 got 30 frames per second with both cameras, but as I zoom in, I see consistently that the new Sony 24-70 f2.8 is noticeably sharper than the old one, partly because of optical sharpness, but also partly because the new one is just slightly more precise with the focusing. Everybody can get by with the old one, but the new one is better. None of these lenses have optical stabilization, but Sony says the new Sony lens is optimized to work with their sensor stabilization. And indeed, I found at 1 and 2 stops below the reciprocal rule, the new lens got about twice as many sharp shots. They both dropped to about 0 at 3 stops below the reciprocal rule.
All All right, next I'm going to check the minimum focusing distance to see how close you can get and still get your subject in focus. So I have it in manual focus, and then it is focused as close as it can get, and I'm gonna lean in until my subject is in focus. And right here, let's switch it out. Am I really close?
Yeah, like scratch the front element close.
Okay, let's go to 70 and see. I didn't expect that.
So the new lens focuses closer, it has more maximum magnification, and it wins at 70 millimeters. This is really useful for wedding photographers who need to get really close for that ring shot, or anybody who wants to do close-up photography. The original lens is not going away. It's still going to be for sale for some lower price that we don't currently know.
But if you want a lens that is lighter, sharper, smaller, like has this cool tactile aperture ring and is also smooth zooming in case you want to do video too, I think you'll definitely want to upgrade to this.
I've owned the old 24-70 f2.8 for many years, and for the longest time I refused to use it. I always used the Canon lens on an adapter because I didn't love it. It wasn't great. This lens is great. So a weakness in the Sony lineup is now a real strength. Even compared to Canon and Nikon, this is my favorite 24-70 ever. Like all the technical reasons, the sharpness, the contrast, but also that aperture ring and the small size. It's so much easier on the shoulder. On a strap, I don't mind carrying it around as much.
So we love it. That's our review. If you want to learn more about photography, how to take photos, how to adjust your settings, how to learn composition and lighting and all of those other things, check out our book, Stunning Digital Photography. It's at our store, northrop.photo, and the ebook's only $9 and it comes with 20 hours of video, never before seen.
And we have a ton of in-depth video training there, Lightroom, Photoshop, the art and science of photography, the professional portraits video training series. Use this coupon code to save yourself a few bucks. Subscribe to see future tutorials, reviews, and so much more. Bye.